if the price of Bitcoin goes down and you have a company like Strategy that has this financial engineering in place, they can buy back shares, they can really engineer keeping a steady or increasing Bitcoin per share. Nowhere in there is there the selling of Bitcoin. How is Home Depot or XYZ company trading at like a 50x mNAV, but someone's saying that, everything's going to crash and burn when something's at a 2 or 3x mNAV? My individual base case is that we'll see an expansion of these companies through the end of the year. We'll have a great 2026 moving forward. What does that mean? What kind of value can I ascribe to that?
This episode of Supply Shock is brought to you by Ledn, a proud Bitcoin-only company and the global leader in Bitcoin-backed lending. Need cash but don't want to sell down your Bitcoin stack? Ledn has a trusted track record in providing liquidity. That's Ledn. You'll hear more about them later in this episode. As always, investments in blockchain technology involve risk. Terms and conditions may apply. Do your own research. The Blockworks Digital Asset Summit, crypto's premier institutional event, is coming back to London this October, the 13th to the 15th. You'll hear from top names across global finance, DeFi, and policy. Think BlackRock, Circle, Coinbase, and the UK Parliament. Notable speakers already locked in include Danny Masters from CoinShares, Jeff Park from Bitwise, and plenty more to come. There's also a VIP dinner on October the 13th. That's for speakers and VIP ticket holders only. It will sell out. It's all happening at the old Billingsgate in London. Use code SUPPLY100 at checkout for £100 off. Quick reminder, nothing said on Supply Shock is a recommendation to buy or sell any investment or product. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and the views expressed by anyone on the show are solely their opinions, not financial advice or necessarily the views of Blockworks. Our hosts, guests, and the Blockworks team may hold positions in the company's funds or projects discussed. Hey everybody, Pete Rizzo, the Bitcoin historian on X, here with another great episode of Supply Shock. Today we've got host of Bitcoin Treasuries podcast, Tim Kotzman. You know him from being on those epic live streams where he's talking to all the insiders in the Bitcoin Treasuries movement. Of course, the corporate Bitcoin adoption story exploding this year, led by Strategy, amassing over 600,000 Bitcoin, 400,000 of that in the last year, but 200 other companies racing to be the next in line to form the Bitcoin 100, the alternative to the S&P that's forming. Here to break it all down, we've got Tim. How are you doing, Tim? Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Doing great. And I think it's going to be a big week.
Going to be a big week, going to be a big rest of the year. You've got the NYC Unconference that you just launched, pretty much the fastest growing event in the Bitcoin space right now. Maybe you can just talk a little bit about, everybody knows the Strategy story. I think the market is still digesting this idea that there's going to be other competitors, right? 200 or more other companies, maybe not even competing, just vying to replicate this idea that a company can run on a Bitcoin standard.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's so much coverage on Strategy and so little coverage, at least here in the States, from mainstream media of Metaplanet or Semler or go down the list. So I think it'll be a really unique opportunity for a lot of the Treasury companies to be in one room, and the synergy that I see and the cooperation that I see between all these companies is right. Sharing best practices and trying to be helpful to each other is something that you certainly don't see in traditional finance most of the time, unfortunately. And I think it's still early from the aspect of I had lunch with a gentleman who is going to be on the capital market side of a yet to be announced Treasury company, not in the US. And he said, Tim, when I'm out there having conversations in traditional finance, he has, almost 30 years of experience here in Manhattan. He said, 0 people really understand Bitcoin, let alone want to talk about Bitcoin or the Treasury company strategy. So sometimes when we're in our bubbles, it's hard to believe that, but that's the reality on the ground.
How do you sum up the opportunity? What's the elevator pitch? I know you're hearing a lot from these companies, but there's a lot of detractors out there, people in the mainstream media who still view the Bitcoin Treasuries as a bubble. Mike Novogratz coming out last week, essentially saying, it's played out, it's over, move along. Obviously, you disagree.
Whether it's a differentiated operating company here domestically, or you're one of the first couple of Bitcoin Treasury public companies in a new jurisdiction. I feel like that's just, it's so early that if you go from 0 to 1, how could that not, not financial advice, right? Markets go up, they go down, they go really high up, they go really far down. And most people understand that. But if you're able to be the first entrant into a new market, um, it's hard for me to be pessimistic on that outcome, just because in some of these markets they don't have Bitcoin ETFs yet. They don't have really even an exchange other than maybe a super localized exchange, or you're going to something like Kraken. So I think there's just a lot of white space, as we call it in the oil and gas industry, to really fill in what these markets need. And it's hard for some of us maybe that are around Bitcoin day in and day out, especially in the US or other major markets, to truly appreciate some of these realities globally, myself included.
I want to drill down into the metrics, the comparisons, how people are looking at these opportunities. One of the things that I find interesting is this is a new investor class. Really, what it seems that they're asking is, if I put $1 in the markets today, am I going to get more Bitcoin in the future? And that's a very new kind of idea, right? Mostly people, I think, have judged dollar investments in the public markets in dollar terms. Here we have this new class of investors that the ones that get more Bitcoin. So maybe you can start there. How do you think about that investor psychology?
The Bitcoin per share is certainly a new metric that people are trying to get their arms around. As far as even the mechanics behind it, you take Strategy as an example, where they've now laid out several things. One being that they're not, except for a couple of circumstances, they're not going to be using their common stock ATM below a 2.5 mNAV, right? Opportunistically between 2.5 and 4, and then, definitely looking to use it above a 4x mNAV. But they've launched these preferred products where they can literally step on these different pedals and sell a preferred product and buy back a common share equity, and really use these different levers to increase Bitcoin per share, whether that is buying Bitcoin or buying back shares. And nowhere in there is there the selling of Bitcoin. I think one of the things that's maybe obvious to people that are staring at terminally online 24 hours a day, staring at their screen, trying to keep up to date and really have our minds wrapped around all of this, is that if the price of Bitcoin goes down and you have a company like Strategy that has this financial engineering in place, they can buy back shares, they can really engineer keeping a steady or increasing Bitcoin per share as far as that metric goes. And again, nowhere in there are they forced to sell Bitcoin. Many of the executives have been very public about, yes, if the price of Bitcoin goes down, the common stock shares could get crushed. But again, nowhere in there is there the selling of Bitcoin. So in some of the conversations that I've been having recently, it's more attention geared towards the custodians. What are the custody risks, and is that even more of a risk than some of these major players out there that seem to be, in the public markets, subject to audits and really seem to have their act together. So it's an interesting time and a lot to get your mind around. And even some of the guys I talk to all the time, when some new product comes out or some new metric comes out, I think a lot of the guys have been very open and transparent about, like, oh, it took me a couple of days or a couple of weeks or even a month or two to even wrap my mind around some of this stuff. So we're all kind of on this journey together.
Well, I want to walk through some of those metrics, maybe talk some examples with companies. There's one, this idea of forward mNAV. So you mentioned mNAV before, this idea that, essentially equating how much Bitcoin the company holds to their market capitalization, trying to come up with some ratio there. And then there's this new metric, sort of forward mNAV. So this idea that the companies will sort of grow into these valuations. And essentially the argument that's being made is that these companies aren't overvalued because typically in the US equities markets, you'll see a company trading at, maybe if it's like a Palantir, 80 times, in some extreme cases, their earnings. So, essentially we're trying to get to valuations that where there's this idea that these metrics kind of show how much these companies can expand. Is there a metric that you like there? Do you like the forward mNAV one? And what's your thought on the valuations of these companies?
They call it the hodler's dilemma. Ever wish you could get access to cash without selling down your stack? Well, Ledn makes that possible. Since 2018, Ledn has issued over $9 billion worth of Bitcoin-backed loans, and they haven't lost a single satoshi of client funds in the process. There are no credit checks. You can get funds in under 12 hours and repay whenever you want with zero penalties. Unlike others, Ledn doesn't lend out your collateral. They even publish biannual proof of reserves verified by top auditors in the blockchain. You can learn more at ledn.io. That's ledn.io.
As always, investments in blockchain technology involve risk. Terms and conditions may apply. Do your own research.
I like the different approaches and individuals coming up with these metrics on a seemingly weekly basis. Some of them stick, some of them create really constructive conversations. I think over time, you'll have Bitcoin per share and mNAV or book value. You'll have maybe one or two or three that are maybe talked about the most, but I think a lot of them at least lead to these constructive conversations and a lot of noise, but constructive conversations usually. And yeah, days to cover, months to cover, all of these different things, I think are constructive, almost like being in a classroom and just being up at the whiteboard saying, hey, let's think through this in a couple of different ways. And to your point, how is Home Depot or XYZ company trading at like a 50x mNAV, but someone's saying that, everything's going to crash and burn when something's at a 2 or 3x mNAV? That just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So yeah, I think there's a lot of room to run here. And I think the really interesting thing is that you look at the price of Bitcoin over the past 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, we've seen some grind higher, but it's not like you've seen an explosive, like the price doubling or tripling or going up 10x. So I think the headlines are just going to become even more pronounced if and when we get some price action in Bitcoin itself. And in the meantime, I mean, I'm in the camp of it is going to take 21 years to really have all of this play out and have Wall Street or TradFi or whatever you want to call the corporates and institutions to really appreciate what's going on and maybe allocate a little bit and then a little bit more. You've even seen that with BlackRock, right? 1%, 2%, wherever they are now. It seems like they're kind of stair-stepping their way up as far as what they're publicly messaging as an allocation amount, which I think is helpful because you have this whole community where, I have, family members and friends that, all the way from college graduates to retirees, and someone that's older may be into MicroStrategy, now strategy, or they may just say, hey, I bought iBit and my life is great. And so I think having all of these different tools available is just hugely helpful for the conversations to meet people where they are. And obviously the preferred products is kind of the latest and greatest in that, where even if you just take the yield, 8, 9, 10%, that's attractive to people. And they may not even realize with some of these products until they dive into them that, oh, with this one, I get a yield with upside, right? To convert if and when the stock goes up to a certain price. So I think this is just kind of in its infancy. And I saw a post, I don't know, within the past few days, and it was this video from, I don't know if it was 20 or 30 some years ago, but it was like how to understand and use the internet, how to access and use Bitcoin. Like,
Happening those conversations daily. Going back to the mNAV conversation a bit, that does seem like it's the metric that people are mostly coordinating around. And it's interesting to see how on both sides people are using it to make calculations, right? So you mentioned that strategy kind of using mNAV as its own sort of rule of thumb to understand their relationship to investors, right? They're sort of only going to use now certain fundraising tactics in relation to this metric. And then I mentioned that tweet, I think it was from Roaring Ragnar, about forward months to cover mNAV, basically saying these companies are undervalued because they can essentially accumulate Bitcoin to kind of fill this kind of gap to mNAV. I guess maybe you could just talk about this relationship, like how are both parties coordinating around this metric, and like what does it mean for both parties? Because it seems like both. It's not like a consistent finite 21 million supply of Bitcoin, right? This mNAV calculation is sort of changing real time based on company dynamics, based on investor dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, that's a question I've actually received, is like, what actually controls or influences, nothing controls, but influences mNAV, right? It's not the management company. It's not, it's market sentiment. It's something around market sentiment. So I guess I'd say it's more art than science at this point, and having guidance come out from public companies saying, hey, here's exactly what we're going to do in between these different mNAV levels is probably the most helpful thing from a guidance standpoint at a market to influence market sentiment, for clarity and understanding. But yeah, I have not read through and dived into the forward mNAV as much as maybe others have to date, but I do see how seeing the history of how much Bitcoin an entity has accumulated and then extrapolating that out over a forward-looking period could be helpful, because if it's similar to any other public company, this is what they did in the past, this is what their earnings are, this is what their treasury is, and if they can repeat that moving forward, what does that mean? What kind of value can I ascribe to that on a forward basis? If that makes sense.
Well, I think it's interesting because, as you mentioned, for the Bitcoin companies going to market, obviously the prize is pretty big, right? It's you'll have a Bitcoin Treasury. Bitcoin will accelerate in value in the future over time. For the investors, maybe in the traditional public markets, this is a way to kind of purchase vehicles that they're familiar with and get a little bit of Bitcoin appreciation mixed in. I feel like it's hardest for the retail investors, right? There's people coming to market right now and they're saying, okay, I want to put $1 into the Bitcoin, into the public markets, and I want to get more Bitcoin. But then in the US markets, now you have 40, 50 companies doing this. In the UK, you've even got 10 or 12, companies doing this. So I guess how do you feel about that calculation? Because it seems like from, the company side and the kind of public, investor side, these institutions that they're dealing with, pretty easy to understand the value proposition there. Do you think it's harder to be a retail investor looking at these different public equities, especially if they're comparing them, right? Like if one can give them more Bitcoin than another, that seems like what the market's trying to figure out right now.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine for a lot of retail investors, which that can be a very broad definition to like ultra high net worth, right? The retail can be kind of broader than I even initially thought as a definition. Unless you have a background in risk and degrees of risk and how to really quantify it and think through it, like how far out on the risk curve are you? If you're in a penny stock, sort of like they're just listed as a penny stock versus another OTC exchange versus the NASDAQ, versus, and then you get into different jurisdictions. How could anyone possibly be an expert on what's going on in Japan if they're sitting in New York and they have a day job right? So I think it does get pretty far out on the risk curve, even if your only consideration is not being familiar with another jurisdiction. And so I think that's where a lot of the analysts that have popped up on social media or have been helpful, because they're able to kind of walk through like what do these terms even mean? How do they interplay with each other? And how can you start thinking through this as far as liquidity, float? I mean, just all of these things that unless you're really kind of deep down into the rabbit hole of these terms and these metrics and calculations, you're like, I don't really know. And I think that's where strategy, MetaPlanet, I was at a lunch a few days ago, and I just said, besides strategy, what other company would you name as a Bitcoin Treasury company at this point? And they said MetaPlanet, and that was it. So again, I think it's going to be a mixture of art and science, of awareness and communication from the executives to really kind of bring this to the forefront and just even have awareness that this is going on, because I would think that a lot of people still kind of view this as a one-off strategy sort of phenomenon if they're not following the Treasury strategy story closely at all. You can only take so much away from a 3, 6, or 12-minute kind of interview on CNBC. So I'm not quite sure what that answer is, but of course, you're starting to see a lot of these director of Bitcoin strategy sort of roles popping up where the companies are, whether it's the founder, an executive, or a Bitcoiner, really trying to put a voice to what's going on and spread awareness through not just memes, although those are important, but also these metrics.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about it from my own personal perspective. It's dawned on me recently, just this calculation, and that I should be making it perhaps, right? So I have a retirement account. I have some MSTR shares allocated in there, but for the most part, I haven't really thought about it. But the question these analysts seem to be asking is essentially, maybe I should be rotating around more frequently, and maybe I should be going to other companies. Maybe there are smaller companies that are outperforming MSTR on any given quarterly basis. So I don't know. I think it's interesting that it's opened up this kind of potential option. So I guess what would you say to somebody who has Bitcoin, has money in their retirement account, they want to maximize their Bitcoin? What kind of advice would you give them, I guess, at that point?
Let's take a quick break to talk about today's sponsor, Ledn, the most trusted name in Bitcoin-backed lending. Look, if you're like me, you never really want to think about selling your Bitcoin. Ledn has a solution. You can borrow against your Bitcoin. No credit checks, no monthly payments, no hidden fees. You can get your cash in under 12 hours and pay back when you want with zero penalties. Unlike other platforms, Ledn has a history of transparency. They prove it with independent proof of reserves audits every 6 months on the blockchain. In total, they've issued more than $9 billion in loans without losing a single satoshi of client funds. That's the kind of track record you want when it comes to securing your Bitcoin. You can learn more. Visit ledn.io. That's ledn.io.
The thing I appreciate about a lot of the guys that I'm on different live streams with, like True North, is many times they say, I have Bitcoin in cold storage. I own Bitcoin, and then I own MSTR or other Bitcoin Treasury companies. I think that's really valuable from an education standpoint, because you have people coming through the door where they saw MetaPlanet somewhere, but they don't know what Bitcoin is yet. So I think that's a great window to get people to dive deeper to Bitcoin. But really in the same way that your sign says buy Bitcoin, right, right beside you. And the meme that I like most from Lynn Alden that I think is the most constructive is like study Bitcoin. I think she kind of known for saying that. I think that's most constructive, like study what strategy has done and try to really understand it, argue with it, write notes in the margins, right? Print out the earnings presentation and see what your opinion is on it. And then that could be constructive as the playbook to kind of go down the market cap, so to speak, on BitcoinTreasuries.net to really see the universe that's out there. It reminds me of when I went onto an exchange in 2021 and started reading all these white papers and buying $5 of every single coin that was listed and thinking I was a financial genius. I don't think anyone's served by being, just kind of ripping it, although everyone's investment style is different, right? So if for someone said recently to me, hey, I took X amount of money, I think it was $1,000 or $2,000, right? And it could be $100 or $200, and put it somewhere and kind of like track it and study and see what happens. So I think, as Ben Workman says, investing is an individual sport, analysis is a team sport. So I think we can all help each other with that. But I don't know that anything constructive is going to come out of going into a long trail of treasury companies and just putting it all on, a certain number and hoping everything works out. I think even the guys that and gals that have been analyzing this stuff for the past 5 years are still learning every day and still trying to be thoughtful about if they allocate and how much.
Obviously, another question that people have is just the diversification of these companies as they come to market. You mentioned the chief Bitcoin officer phenomenon. That's been a big trend. But we've seen, some heavyweights come to market. Trump Media, Adam Back's Bitcoin company, the Bitcoin Treasury Standard company, Jack Mallers with 21. How do these companies differentiate? Are you getting a feeling of like what they can do from an actual operating company standpoint, or a marketing standpoint? It's like, how do they differentiate from the rest of the companies in the category? Because it just feels like in the US, I think you mentioned, obviously geography is a key way to differentiate. I think there's a lot of value there. When it comes to kind of competing in the US, I guess you get a feeling of how that's going to shake out.
I'd start with the reality of there's the announcement, and then there's putting Bitcoin on the balance sheet and confirming that it's there, meaning there's a press release saying that it's there. I know there's been, I'm sure there have been at least one or several companies that have kind of announced that they were pursuing a Bitcoin Treasury strategy, and then they never put any Bitcoin on their balance sheet. And maybe they changed their mind. Maybe there was a good reason for it. But I think the announcement and announcements about announcements may be good to know something's in the wings. But for many of these, even if they've raised money, it's still an escrow. Even if they've announced, there may or may not be Bitcoin actually on the balance sheet because of the realities of the public markets, and it just takes time to go through these reverse mergers, SPACs, whatever the mechanism is to actually get everything going. So I think it's for a lot of these, it's just too soon to tell. If there's an announcement where there's an existing operating business, then that's pretty straightforward. But the reality is, a lot of these executives are kind of outlining that they're exploring these different avenues, and it's not a negative thing, but I think even they may not know exactly what the secret sauce is going to be. And that's okay, right? If you can buy operating business for below NAV and that's accretive, great. But, I guess people would just call that opportunistic as far as the path forward. I personally think that the more, we talk about money and the closer you are to the money printer, the more, the better your life's going to be. And that's not really a fair system. I think at this point, it's really a reality of the closer you can be to digital media, digital collateral, digital property, digital opportunities, digital community. I think that's kind of an obvious play. And so you've seen several of them, including one or two that you mentioned, having these kind of digital first businesses, whether it's mobile, whether it's digital media, social media, and some sort of Bitcoin native or Bitcoin first or Bitcoin plus sort of operating business. I think that could make a lot of sense, depending on what market you're in and what all those variables are. But I think that from a high speed, low drag point of view makes a lot of sense. It's like renting instead of owning. You can kind of shuck and jive, and um, Apple can, I think Michael Saylor's famous for saying Apple can come up with something and ship it to everybody over the weekend for, basically nothing. I think there's a lot of power in that. And I think the closer you can be, at least with something in your business, being very close to the digital aspect of it, and incorporating AI wherever possible is going to be just kind of very obvious play at this point.
So we got the digital asset treasury company phenomenon now. There's this expansion beyond Bitcoin, other companies, copying this vehicle and then, moving, as you mentioned, out the risk curve to riskier assets, maybe some of the ones in 2021 that you dipped your toes in. I guess, what do you think about when you hear a BNB treasury company, an XRP treasury company? Well, obviously, as a Bitcoiner myself, I wouldn't have a lot of confidence in those models, but it does seem that we're going to see some very big offerings come to market to try to replicate the strategy. Does that threaten the movement here? Does that leave a bad taste in Wall Street's mouth if some of the stuff goes down?
I think we're all on this education curve. Even someone that's been in Bitcoin since day one, it's kind of a brave new world. I'm going to not say the names of any particular digital asset other than maybe the word stable coins, because I was talking somewhere within the last couple of months and I said the name of a token, and literally there's just articles kind of taking those words and saying, hey, Tim said that this is getting a lot of attention and this might be the new big thing and this is like undeniable, and I'm like, that's not what I said. So I mean, to the extent that there's a use case around stable coins and being able to export the US dollar, I think that I think stable coins make a lot of sense. I think Bitcoin is very proven and obvious to those that have studied it. The other ones, I don't know. I haven't studied them. I'm probably not going to study them. And I think that if there's a compelling use case, then certainly the market will decide. I just think, to your point, that it's further out the risk curve. I think the focus and the bulk of the attention will continue to be on Bitcoin. I mean, even last night, as Bitcoin was running up to $121,000, $122,000, and it was up between 4 and 5%, I think, on the day. As I very briefly looked at the couple of tokens below that on the leaderboard, it was like 10% of that, 1% of that, negative. So I think a lot of the attention's on Bitcoin right now. And I think we do need innovation, and I'm sure there will be useful applications and use cases for other tokens, but I haven't spent enough time to have an informed opinion. And I think a lot of the bulk of the attention right now from corporates and institutions are on Bitcoin, and I think that we'll see that continue.
So you look at the leaderboard of all the Bitcoin Treasury companies right now. Are you in your mind that we're going to see an expansion? This goes out to 500 companies, 1,000 companies, or you think we'll see contraction this year? I guess as you're looking towards the end of Q3, Q4, does this boom? Does this contract? Is there more competition? What do you think?
Yeah, I think we'll see an expansion through the end of the year. At the Bitcoin for Corporations conference at Strategy World in Orlando back in May, Phong Le was up on stage saying by the end of the year, you'll have 700 companies. And some of the guys that I work with that were there said they initially thought, there's no way. And then they thought for a second, they're like, darn it, he's right. Right? That's the thing about Phong. He's always right. No one's always right. But I think this, without getting into, price action and predictions that are kind of not constructive or helpful, it seems like a little bit of a different cycle where we could grind higher. So that's kind of my individual base case is that we'll see an expansion of these companies through the end of the year. We'll have a great 2026. And when, even if winter's not coming back, there's still volatility, right? If this is a leveraged NASDAQ, for those that don't care to study it yet, there's going to be a lot of volatility. And so I think that could also be a great M&A story, where it's not necessarily a negative if one treasury company buys up another treasury company. That's what happens in the market. So I think there's a constructive, optimistic yet constructive way to look at all of this, where your head's not in the clouds, but it's still a good story, right? If we're going to keep printing money and everything's going higher, then over time with volatility, that's kind of my view.
We saw earlier this year there was some attempts to get some of the larger companies active on this, right? There was double activist shareholders efforts. Meta, the Facebook parent company, at the Bitcoin conference, having a live phone call. There was Michael Saylor at the end of last year getting on Microsoft's call, giving the pitch for Bitcoin. Obviously, Bitcoin at this point outperforming the US dollar for the last 15 years. When do these companies start waking up to that? Do you expect to see one of the kind of, Mag 7s or one of the big stocks, companies take a leap here this year?
My crystal ball is fuzzy on that one. Probably more likely that you have a public company maybe talk about how they are looking at Bitcoin and stablecoins for cross-border payments or employee incentives than maybe an actual treasury strategy. But I think you will also see at some point one of the Mag 7, putting Tesla aside, having someone else put some nominal amount in, whether that's a few basis points, whether it's 1%. And that could lead to other public companies, large public companies, saying, okay, yeah, well, if Joe's putting 1% on, then we'll put 1% on. And then from there, maybe that's the end of that crescendo for a time, right? You have a lot of the larger public companies putting, a few basis points to 1% on, kind of as a nod to like, yes, we understand the value proposition of Bitcoin, but we also kind of want you to leave us alone. Right? We don't have a need to know yet. Our cash, we have strong cash flows, and we have a bunch of cash sitting there. So that's my just personal view on how some of those could go. And if you have other major countries with, it seemingly the U.S. in the lead, not just creating a Bitcoin strategic reserve, but then announcing a proactive accumulation strategy, I think that will be, whether it's this year, next year, some year soon, that will be something that will ripple globally, because the U.S. seems to be leading on all of this. You have an El Salvador or a Bhutan or other countries proactively stacking Bitcoin and being pro-Bitcoin, but from a capital markets and a political perspective, it seems like the U.S. is willing to lead and kind of needs to lead in order for other countries to have that sort of political cover to move forward.
So you got the conference coming up in September. Obviously, going to be a big event. Bringing together a lot of leaders of this movement. You've had a unique vantage point. You've talked to a lot of the, chief executives at these companies. Maybe as we wind down here, just your thoughts of just the trends for the end of the year and the treasury sector. I'm sure you're bullish on the Bitcoin price, but looking to hear kind of what you think we might see otherwise from this class of companies.
Yeah, I think you'll see additional companies on trying to more or less tokenize their stock, whether it's on Liquid or something else. I believe Liquid has Strategy and Metaplanet kind of on there. So I think you'll see that trend continue. And that's just, a positive for the ecosystem. I think you'll certainly see more clarity with the specific strategies that the companies are employing, whether it's stacking Bitcoin and doubling their stack with weekly or monthly announcements or whatever that strategy is, along with the operating side and the M&A acquisition side. So yeah, I think it's going to be a lot of noise, a little bit of signal, and a lot to really cover. So it's very exciting.
Yeah, well, obviously with the price running up, it only gets harder for these companies to acquire. We've got MicroStrategy or Strategy now teetering on the door of 3% of the total supply. Obviously, I'd assume I'd take the bet that they're going to pass that. The rest of the market beyond Strategy, 300,000 coins. So still, somewhere around 1.5% of the supply. Do you see a meaningful expansion on that side?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very ironic and humorous and uh, you know, instructful. That's not a word. Very instructive. I think it's very instructive that when Michael Saylor first started the strategy, he kind of said, "Look, I was up at night, kind of nervous that someone else was going to figure this out before I could accumulate a meaningful amount of Bitcoin or, really have a position." And now we're, as of a few days ago, it's 5 years later from when they announced their Bitcoin Treasury strategy, and they're in the lead. There's really no company that even has half the stack or a quarter of the stack of what they have. So I think you'll see that trend continue. And yeah, I think that's what people will probably surprise a lot of market participants is, getting to 4% of the Bitcoin supply or having 1 million Bitcoin in one public entity. I think that will surprise and kind of grab the attention of a lot of people if and when that happens.
Fascinating stuff, Tim. Appreciate you being on the podcast. Where can people find out more about everything you're up to?
Everything's on X at Tim Kotzman.
All right, well, keep it tuned. Know your spaces are out there and active, so if you're following Tim, put on those alerts. We'll be out in the UK this October for Digital Asset Summit. If you're following Blockworks, blockworks.co/events, Digital Asset Summit will be bringing the best leaders in the digital asset space out for conversations over there in England. I'll be there bringing a Bitcoin perspective to the crypto conversation. If you're watching on YouTube, X, or Rumble, feel free to like or hit that subscribe button. This has been Supply Shock, Blockworks Podcast.